But I wanted to share with you today the upfront truth of concerning loving your neighbor. And that is, it's not always a joyous occasion. In fact, it might even be, at times, quite unpleasant. But we are to love anyway. Christ, we know, is our perfect example. He set the standard for us. He lived the perfect life. A faultless man who loved the Father with all his heart and loved his neighbor as himself. Jesus is, in fact, love incarnate. He is perfect love that took upon himself human flesh. For God is love. Christ is God. Therefore, logically, we can say that Christ is love. Am I moving too quick for anybody? All right, I'll slow down. The entire law and the prophets can be summed up in this: love God, love your neighbor. So how did Christ uphold the entire law? Perfect love. Love that was without fault. Love without wavering. Love that was unaltered by circumstances. An unstoppable, unyielding love. Now, there is something that is difficult to comprehend, but important to understand, and that is, in my mind, to reconcile, to figure out how one who loved so perfectly, how can one who loved so perfectly suffer so intensely? That is, how can you do everything right and still be called a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief? And if he, meaning Christ, loved his neighbor and suffered, if we love our neighbor, will we also have a cross to bear? Last week, Pastor David spoke about the Good Samaritan, and there was a time and a financial cost that the Samaritan took upon himself when showing compassion to this person who was in need, who was described as being his neighbor. And today I just want to take a few minutes, just a few minutes. Trust me, this has been whittled down to the bare minimum. Can anybody stick with me for like the next 15 minutes? I believe you have that self-discipline. Today I don't want to look so much at a monetary cost, but an emotional investment, in an emotional price to pay, an emotional burden to bear. We're not talking about money or bandages or oil or wine like we did last Sunday. We're talking about an emotional burden to bear. I want to present to you this reality. Even if it may not be pleasant to endure, there really is such a thing as good grief. So Charlie Brown was absolutely right. What is it that will inevitably accompany loving your neighbor? Grief. No joke. What will inevitably accompany loving your neighbor? Grief. And the only thing that makes it good is that it is born out of and endured willingly because of love. You see, love and grief are two peas in a pod. In this life, loving others, loving your neighbor, without fail, be accompanied by, you guessed it, good grief. Now, grief may not be a constant, and I hope it isn't, but it will never be far away. We aren't calling it good because it's pleasant, or a grief that is enjoyable, or a grief that is without pain and heartache. We are talking about a grief that comes complete with all of these not so fun things, and it may even be accompanied by more negatives that make it even more unpleasant. If you love, you will endure grief. Love anyway. Before I use Christ as an example, let me go ahead and give you a glimpse of our application. If we love our neighbor, we will be inviting grief to tag along. Grief won't be far away. It is good to love, and there is such a thing as good grief, because even if unpleasant, it is born out of love. That does not make it fun to endure or enjoyable, but because it is born out of love, and love is eternal, and God is love, and love is commanded, and love is required, and love has invaded a fallen world, it is good grief. When you allow love to flourish within you, grief is never far behind. And in this life, grief will never depart as love's accomplice. To love your neighbor is to invite grief. Jesus, as our example, he loved the world. He loved those that were far off. Jesus was in a very, very good place before he came here. He was with the Father. And Jesus looked upon the world and loved the world. And the Father looked upon mankind and loved mankind. And the Father said to the Son, go down there and love them. And they both knew what that would mean. They both knew the cost of this love. They both knew that the grief would inevitably follow this love. And I don't just mean the cross alone. I mean there was tremendous suffering on the part of the Father and the Son because they chose to love us. The third to the last point is this. You like how I phrased that in the positive? It's like, oh, we're almost done. We're at the third to the last point already. Some of you just write it down, think about it later. Jesus, by choosing to love his neighbor, invited grief. Jesus, by choosing to love his neighbor, invited grief. For although Jesus was perfect love, he was despised. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. This description of Jesus was written before he came to earth. How? Because God knew love was not cheap, and Christ would know grief. And he loved anyway. Here's the bad news. There's more, there's more bad news. I kind of feel like Eeyore this morning. Like Eeyore when he said, oh, what did he say? There's one cloud in the sky, and it's drizzling on me. Why am I not surprised? But he also said, never stop looking for the sunshine. So in other words, we've got some bad news, but friends, don't stop looking for the sunshine. The sunshine's there. We live in a fallen world. The more you love, the more you are vulnerable to sorrow and grief. The more you love, the more sorrow and grief you will endure. And yet love is worth it. Because love will outlast grief and sorrow. Love will endure when all else fails away. Loving your neighbor will not always be a walk in the park on a clear and pleasant day. Loving your neighbor is to invite grief. Loving your neighbor may sometimes mean a monetary cost, but there will definitely be an emotional cost. Let me give you a couple bullet point thoughts on how the perfect man had this perfect love, and he grieved when loving his neighbor. This is the second to the last point, and unmistakably the longest of the three, and likely longer than any other sermon point that has ever been lingered over for an extended period of time up to this day. But here we go. Because of love, Jesus grieved over broken relationships. And I'm going to mention these passages, but they're written down so you can look them up or you can follow along or what have you. But Jesus, because of love, Jesus grieved over broken relationships. And he grieved over broken relationships of all kind. But let's begin with those that are farthest away, okay? Enemies. There was a broken relationship between Jesus and those who opposed him, but loving one's neighbor means longing for those relationships to be mended. It was in the best interests of those who despised and rejected him to have that relationship mended. And that's even true today. If you have a broken relationship with Jesus, first off, he grieves over that. But secondly, it's in your best interest to have that relationship mended. He came for you, not for him. Jesus grieved over enemies that should be friends. In Luke chapter 13, he cries out, he says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those who sent you, how often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." So here Jesus is crying out. He's suffering brokenness over this separation. He has longing and desire. It's a perfect love that is mourning the division between the Savior and those that he longed to bring under his wing, to protect and to save. So Jesus approached them as a friend that had their best interest in mind, a friend that came to give and not to take away. But the relationship remained broken because they were not willing. And yet Christ longed for them because love grieves over broken relationships, even when the other party is an enemy. So if we obey the command, love your neighbor and love your enemy, then there will be grief over broken relationships. If you love your enemy, there will be grief. But enemies aren't the only example. There's other examples, aren't you glad? Because there's more. Loving your neighbor will also occasionally encounter what we might call a misunderstanding. Have you ever been misunderstood? Or have you ever had somebody upset with you and they misunderstood? It happens. Listen, Jesus was misunderstood. And this brought about less than perfect relationships, even broken relationships, which inevitably brought grief. So here we have the perfect man who possessed a perfect love for his neighbor, who also was the greatest communicator of all time, and he was misunderstood. All right? The most selfless, most loving, most sincere, with perfect integrity and compassion, he gave of himself to others, and yet how often he found himself grieving over those who didn't understand him. Who he was or his purpose of bringing life. In Luke chapter 19, he again cries out for Jerusalem because Jerusalem didn't understand. And Christ said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. Again, there's this longing, there's this wishful thinking that a true understanding of who he was would lead to a broken relationship being mended. But because it wasn't mended, because it was broken, because of a misunderstanding, there was grief. And even worse than that, if we can go worse just for a second, it's not worse than the gnats out there, so don't be in too much of a rush to get out of here. As soon as I finish up, you've got gnats. Enjoy your time. Worse than that, how often was Jesus misunderstood by those who were closest to him? So I'm not trying in this moment to exonerate the guilty or make an excuse for him, but listen, Judas was confused. Hello? Judas was confused. Thomas was confused. Peter was confused. And then when those two brothers were jockeying for position in Christ's kingdom, they sure didn't grasp the kingdom that Christ was promoting. Read the Gospels at times. Jesus was grieved over not just enemies, but also over misunderstandings. Christ loved his neighbors, whether enemies or friends, and both parties often misunderstood, and that was a source of grief. And love longs to be genuinely understood and resolve misunderstandings if possible. But we can't stop there. We have a finish line to get to and gnats that need to be fed. Jesus' love and grief went even further than his own friends and enemies. Jesus even grieved over broken relationships when they weren't his own. Jesus even grieved over broken relationships when they weren't his own. We sometimes call that empathy. It's taking love to a whole new level. It's feeling sorrow over someone else's pain. Someone you love hurts, and so you hurt. So because of love, listen, you find yourself grieving due to someone else's sorrow. Does anybody else see the trouble that love can bring? The unpleasantness, the discomfort. Because you love, somebody else is hurting. You're fine. They're hurting. And so you endure this unpleasant thing called grief. We really might as well face it. If you love, you will experience sorrow and grief. If you don't love, you don't care. But when you do love, you do care. And that is to welcome with open arms this unpleasant thing called grief. Because love and grief are two peas in a pod. And in this life, they are inseparable. And the greater the measure of the first, the greater the measure of the second. As uninviting as this sounds, there is such a thing as good grief. Grief that is brought about by love. Though grief is unpleasant, it can only be described as good because the source is love. Jesus knew about Lazarus being dead. And Jesus announced that he was going to go where Lazarus was buried. For the purpose, of raising him back to life. And Jesus, by the way, knew about heaven. He had been there before. And Jesus knew about everlasting life. He was trying to, talk to others and explain it to them. They weren't really understanding it that well. But Jesus even knew that if he didn't raise Lazarus, that Mary and Martha and Christ and Lazarus, they would all be united in eternity because these were people who trusted God. But we read in John chapter 11 that when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he saw all this weeping and he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled, and Jesus wept. He wept. Not because he didn't know if he could raise Lazarus up, but because of all the sorrow around him. You see, loving your neighbor means joining into grief that isn't necessarily your own. Any broken relationships, whether your own enemies or your friends who misunderstand, or even the broken relationships of others. Because of love, Jesus knew sorrow, and we too have that cross to bear if we are to obey the command, love our neighbor. And that brings us to the grand finale, which may only be considered grand because it is so long. And that is, loving your neighbor will inevitably be accompanied by grief. Loving your neighbor will inevitably be accompanied by grief. Inevitably. You say it. Listen, Jesus ascended. That perfect love that walked this earth was now gone. Jesus ascended, and now we are his body. We are to love our neighbor. And as long as we live and minister within a fallen world, love will be accompanied by grieving. As long as there are broken relationships, as long as there are misunderstandings, as long as there are enemies, as long as there is parting, as long as there is physical death, as long as there is sickness and trouble and pain and trouble, and I realize I said trouble twice, but that's because there is a lot of trouble. Wherever these things transpire, let the church be right there in the midst, and let the church find itself in the thick of it, and let love be made present, and there too will be love's companion, no, our companion, grief. And may the church not only grieve over the troubles of this temporal life, but also concerning those things that are eternal. In Romans chapter 9, verse 2 and 3, we read of the missionary Paul's sorrow. Over what? Over the Jews' broken relationship with God. He says, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my brothers, for those of my own race. He said, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish. You see, Paul loved his people. And Paul longed to reach them for Christ's sake. And too often that relationship remained broken and love grieved. Paul grieved with unceasing anguish over what? Over something that had eternal consequences, over broken relationships, not even his own. Listen, Paul was fine. He was redeemed. He was stamped. He was sealed. The problem was he loved his people, and something was broken. And love saw the situation. And what accompanied this love? If you can't guess it, good grief. Hey, that's also the answer. What accompanied this love that Paul had for those of his people? It was good grief. Unceasing anguish? Why? Because of love. Love is the culprit. Love is the source. Love is the reason. Love is the cause of this grief. Love brought suffering with it. Love brought its buddy, grief. A couple weeks ago, Pastor David challenged us with a statement that requires some self-examination, and I hate to repeat it, but I'm going to just repeat it. That statement was, we just don't care. You remember that one? Ouch. Is that true? What happens if we just don't love? Stick with me, I'm almost done. If it is true that in this life, wherever love is, grief will be the tag-along. And if it is true, the greater the love, the greater the accompanying grief. And if the perfect man possessed the perfect love, yet still can be described as a man of suffering and acquainted with grief, all stemming from loving his neighbor. And if there are broken relationships all around us among men and between men and God, and if there is pain, and if there is suffering, and if there is division, and if there are still those who are separated from God, as Paul mourned over, what does it mean if grief among the believers is sparse? What if it is hard to find or rarely seen? It could either mean that all is well, or it could mean we just don't love as we ought. Or it means we would love up to the border of comfort and rarely beyond. We'd love like an infant. No one likes suffering. Grief is not a pleasant experience, but there is such a thing as grief that is born out of love. And this grief, though not enjoyable, is a good grief. And it's high time that unconditional love for neighbor, with its accompanying grief, comes back into style among believers. Church, there is coming a day when tears will be wiped away. There is coming a day when sorrow will be no more, but that day is not today, and that is not this hour. Love still grieves today. We could even say that good grief is a proof of love, and we are to love. In fact, I would be even so bold as to say if you've never suffered grief, you've probably never loved. This brings new insight to Jesus' words, "Blessed are those who mourn." These are those who have learned how to love. Those that can be described as men and women of sorrow, acquainted with grief, because in the midst of a hurting world, a world where brokenness exists, Jesus' love remains, and it remains in his church.